For Michael Kinsley, to whom I still owe an article. The most difficult subjects can be explained to the most slow-witted man if he has not formed any idea of them already. But the simplest thing cannot be made clear to the most intelligent man if he is firmly persuaded that he knows already, without a shadow of a doubt, what is laid before him. Leo Tolstoy, 1897. Prologue. Poltergeist. The willingness of a Wall Street investment bank to pay me hundreds of thousands of dollars to dispense investment advice to grown-ups remains a mystery to me to this day. I was 24 years old, with no experience of, or particular interest in, guessing which stocks and bonds would rise and which would fall. Wall Street's essential function was to allocate capital, to decide who should get it and who should not. Believe me when I tell you that I hadn't the first clue. I'd never taken an accounting course, never run a business, never even had savings of my own to manage. I'd stumbled into a job at Salomon Brothers in 1985 and stumbled out richer in 1988. And even though I wrote a book about the experience, the whole thing still strikes me as totally preposterous, which is one reason the money was so easy to walk away from. I figured the situation was unsustainable. Sooner rather than later, someone was going to identify me, along with a lot of people more or less like me, as a fraud. Sooner rather than later would come a great reckoning, when Wall Street would wake up, and hundreds, if not thousands, of young people like me, who had no business making huge bets with other people's money or persuading other people to make those bets, would be expelled from finance. When I sat down to write my account of the experience, Liar's Poker it was called, it was in the spirit of a young man who thought he was getting out while the getting was good. I was merely scribbling down a message and stuffing it into a bottle for those who passed through these parts in the far distant future. Unless some insider got all this down on paper, I figured, no future human would believe that it had happened. Up to that point, just about everything written about Wall Street had been about the stock market. The stock market had been, from the very beginning, where most of Wall Street lived. My book was mainly about the bond market, because Wall Street was now making even bigger money packaging and selling and shuffling around America's growing debts. This, too, I assumed was unsustainable. I thought I was writing a period piece about the 1980s in America, when a great nation lost its financial mind. I expected readers of the future would be appalled that back in 1986, the CEO of Salomon Brothers, John Goodfriend, was paid $3.1 million as he ran the business into the ground. I expected them to gape in wonder at the story of Howie Rubin, the Salomon Brothers mortgage bond trader, who had moved to Merrill Lynch and promptly lost $250 million. I expected them to be shocked that once upon a time on Wall Street, the CEOs had only the vaguest idea of the complicated risks their bond traders were running. And that's pretty much how I imagined it. What I never imagined is that the future reader might look back on any of this, or on my own peculiar experience, and say, how quaint, how innocent. Not for a moment did I suspect that the financial 1980s would last for 2 full decades longer, and that the difference in degree between Wall Street and ordinary economic life would swell to a difference in kind. That a single bond trader might be paid $47 million a year and feel cheated. That the mortgage bond market invented on the Salomon Brothers trading floor, which seemed like such a good idea at the time, would lead to the most purely financial economic disaster in history. That exactly 20 years after Howie Rubin became a scandalous household name for losing $250 million, another mortgage bond trader, named Howie, inside Morgan Stanley, would lose $9 billion on a single mortgage trade and remain essentially unknown, without anyone beyond a small circle inside Morgan Stanley ever hearing about what he'd done or why. When I sat down to write my first book, I had no great agenda, apart from telling what I took to be a remarkable tale. If you'd gotten a few drinks in me and then asked what effect the book would have on the world, I might have said something like, I hope that college students trying to decide what to do with their lives might read it and decide that it's silly to phony it up and abandon their passions, or even their faint interests, to become financiers.